Well, hello Rudi. I'm here with Rudi Wiens, our coordinator in Eurasia. People in Australia would love to know about Rudi. You've been just over 40 years with FEBC.
That's a long time.
It's a long time, and you've seen many changes during that time. But we'd like to know a little bit about your beginnings, because you grew up in Siberia.
Yeah. I like to say it was a privilege to grow up in Siberia. So it was cold in the winter, but it was nice, warm.
In Australia, we used to watch movies, and it was like, only the bad people were sent to Siberia. So that was not you, yeah?
Not only in Australia. In many countries, I've heard that the bad people are being sent to Siberia. So, and especially kids are warned about it. So I tell the kids, don't worry, it's not that bad, so you can survive. So it was a good childhood, actually. So my childhood was in Siberia, in west part of Siberia, actually. And then my youth was more, in Estonia, which was under Soviet Union. And then we had the privilege to migrate to Germany, and there I went to a Bible college, and basically, and then all my adult lives was connected with FEBC.
What was it like being a Christian in those days?
Well, my parents became believers before I was born, so that was a privilege. Like, we heard the gospel from our parents. They were a part of the so-called underground church.
Yeah.
We never met underground, but it was in houses. It was not official. It was illegal, and so we kids, we were around, and heard that. So of course there was people didn't have Bibles. They had handwritten copies. Some portions. Some had old somewhere, but they were hiding it. So the KGB often came and disturbed it, and whatever they found, they of course confiscated. So we got smart in hiding stuff, So,
yes.
So it was
Then how did you first connect with FEBC? I believe that you first heard an FEBC broadcast. Is that
That's right. That's right. Back in Siberia, we listened to the Far East broadcasting, the Russian broadcast from the Philippines via shortwave. Shortwave was the only connection with the outside world for us.
Yeah. So did you have you wouldn't have any idea then you'd actually be the one behind the microphone instead of listening to it?
It was not even a dream. I remember as a kid we played to go to America or something like that under the blanket, in that sense, other side of the world. But I didn't think that I would ever see Moscow.
Yeah.
That was kind of Siberia. That would probably be our whole life, and our childhood.
And then you said you did some theological training. So then what was the transition then to FEBC?
Yeah, I was after past my military service duties with the Soviet Army. So I was a terrible soldier. So they didn't know what to do with me. They promised actually prison time, but.
And why were you a terrible soldier?
Because I objected. I objected the whole ideology. So I was kind of a young, not trained dissident. So basically, I said, no, I'm not willing to follow your commands, because I disagree with the atheistic, with the godless ideology, period, in that sense. Yeah. So they didn't know what to do with me, so I played pacifistic, so I played, okay, if you want to shoot me, go ahead, in that sense. So, and of course, what would they do as a boy, so 18 years, 19 years of age then.
So from there, what was the next step on your journey?
Yeah, the next step, instead of ending up in prison, we ended up immigrating to Germany, West Germany. And that was kind of a Helsinki agreement in '72, I think it was, that the Soviets had to let some people that had connections with other countries, go on. So lots of Jewish people left the country then, not lots, some. And some that had relatives, like we didn't have direct relatives, but our relatives had relatives in Germany, and so on. Then there was a chain reaction. So we ended up in the mid-'70s to migrate to Germany. And that's when I met the people we listened to,
right.
Far East broadcasting people, and so the radio preachers, as we call them, so that who we listened to, and they actually told us. I remember Jack Kozlov, so my boss actually in FEBC for a number of years. He was my father generation, so he said, Rudi, if you will not help us, God will punish you. So that was kind of
that was your calling.
That was a kind of calling. So
that was
I didn't follow that, but it made me pray about it and think about it, and that's when I decided to get some Bible training before joining.
So you did some Bible training, Did you do training in broadcasting? Because that's a
No.
or sort of learn while you were doing it?
No, not in the Bible college. I didn't do that. So, but we had some. So some of these broadcasters, senior broadcasters that we used to listen to. So they invited us, and they recorded testimonies of us. Some singing. You know, the Christian music was very limited. You know, so they didn't have much in their library to use. You know, so they used that kind of testimonial of young people. We were the young people then. You know, so. That's what we did, and that was the training, you know. And then I ended up practicing, but it was all hand-on training, you know. Put behind, get something, create some programs for young people, you know. So we did it.
So that broadcasting then you were doing then was from Saipan.
No, Saipan came later in the 80s, you know.
Okay.
So that was FEBC had the Philippines mainly, you know, and then they did also broadcast, and they still have a little broadcast from Jeju Island on AM. Like the AM station, the 250 kilowatt AM station.
Right, so that's in Korea. That's the
island
of Korea.
The far east of Russia, you know, and even Siberia. Sometimes we got it in, but that was already distance, you know, it's so far. So we mainly listened to shortwave from Manila at that time, and then of course the Saipan station came in the early 80s, you know. So that became a very significant broadcast.
Let's fast forward then a little bit, because then the only way to get messages in that day when FEBC began in the late 40s into China, and then obviously then into Russia was through shortwave, and then of course now today. So we fast forward. So there was originally a radio station and still is, in Russia.
Yes, so basically in the 80s when we lived on Saipan, one of our daughters was born on Saipan, and those were from 86 to 90, and those were the years when, you know, Gorbachev time, everybody, you know, perestroika, you know, glasnost, democratization, you know, democratization and so on. So those were interesting years, and we broadcasted 10 hours daily to the Soviet Union in the Russian language. So we had different programs, you know, and so on, even we had some programs from Australia by Russians, you know, produced. So we put them on schedule, and I did live basically, but it was at that time it was more a monologue. So I tried to make noise and hit my guitar sometimes, but people loved it, you know. It was live. And I really, because it was a daily broadcast, I couldn't pre-record it. It would be, so I rather did more, you know, in that sense. And we had blocks for the Far East and central part of Soviet Union, and then European, you know, because of the time zones. And the broadcast, the shortwave broadcast, go through the night. You know, the daylight is not good for shortwave. And so we started actually in 87, late 87. That's when the changes already started to happen, and then the censorship came down. I was told later, you know, and so we started to receive letters, 1,000 per day and more, you know, so it was incredible.
1,000 per day.
Yeah,
so these were people who in the past weren't able to communicate, but they were hearing.
That's right. And I would say close to 100% of all the responses, there was also a begging for a Bible.
Wow. Yes.
So because people had never seen a Bible, you know, so it was the curiosity was so great.
So the impact of radio then, just to touch on that, then just while you're in the midst of that, was quite significant during those early years.
I tell you, even later on in the 90s when we started to travel there, all 100% Christians knew me. I was famous, you know, so not now anymore, you know, so now there are different avenues, and which is good, you know, the development, many more churches and so on. But in those days, everybody knew us, you know, so, and of course many non-Christians, because even among the general population there was a curiosity about the West, you know, and so on, and the only thing they could hear was via shortwave, you know. Of course they listened to the political stations like Radio Free Europe, the BBC, and all those broadcasts, but among those we were. And we had even a better message than the BBC and to Radio Free Europe and also. So
I always hear a story about how one of the first stations in Russia ended up being at the very place where the Russians used to jam, or the Soviets in those days, right? It was not more than just Russia that we think of today as the Soviet Union. jammed. So can you just very quickly just sort of say how that was itself a miracle, yeah?
Well, in FEBC, in our ministry, so we started to talk, what will we do now? And I was asked, I was still young, in the late 80s, and so and Dr. Bowman, they were asking, what should we do now?
Dr. Bowman, the founder of FEBC Ministry, yeah.
That's right. So they said, I said, if we want to be on a cutting edge, we have to go into the country. Is it possible? I was asked, I said, we have to try it, we will never know if it's possible or not. It was we called them the wild 90s, because they were really wild in the former Soviet Union or former Russia. And so since our name was Far East Broadcasting, so from the Far East, so I thought I took a trip to the Far East of Russia, Vladivostok, Khabarovsk. Khabarovsk was a central city there, the open city, kind of, and so on. And that's when I met listeners, we had listeners everywhere throughout any city in Russia, I could start something, but it was my vision, let's start in the Far East, Khabarovsk.
Yes.
And so Sergey, my friend, listener, so he was the son of a pastor there, so a young fellow, my age, even younger than me, so when I was young then.
Yes.
So we started to look, and I said, let's try to incorporate a Christian radio agency or ministry, in that sense. And so we had a hard time with the name first. We called ourselves Far East Agency of Christian Broadcasting, a terrible long name, but in Russian the first two letters are the DVA, Дальневосточное агентство, and so on. It's Radio 2, like the DVA. It's a word for two, number 2, So we were known at the beginning there as Radio 2, Radio 2, 2. And so we got incorporated. It was a miracle. In '92, we were I have looked into it. We were the first non-government radio organization incorporated in Russia, to my knowledge.
Yes, yeah.
There were no others, Shortly after, then there came a couple more, kind of political and so on, so like non-government, like Echo of Moscow, so they came shortly after that. And so we got incorporated, so there was no law against us, so some well-minded person said, okay, let's incorporate them. So we got incorporated, and we started to look for a local broadcast. And so we started an AM broadcast locally. We got the license, and actually first we bought time. We took time on the government radio broadcast on March 1, '92.
You found this
and then
station.
the same year we found this place, with antennas, so we looked at them. There was a chief engineer said, we used to jam you, so up to 87, and that's what he said. But since late 87, we are just sitting around doing nothing. So it was
now
a
it's
while.
transformed for God.
And I said, okay, let's do that.
These
These transmitters, they have never broadcast anything, any audio, so just noise, So but we can modulate them and use them.
Let's move forward again. Okay, so now there's a radio station in the Far East, but we did have a couple of stations then. There was
that went so fast.
Yeah.
Just within the first 92, 93, the 90s, we had an FM station in Ussurisk, in Vladivostok we broadcast. We had the Krasnoyarsk studio, we had in Kemerovo, Novosibirsk, and Izhevsk, and Ulan-Ude for the Buryat people,
So I wasn't aware we had so many.
That went on like mushrooms, so in that sense. But then, and it was so inexpensive because of the economy, a dollar went a long way. I remember flying the 8 hours jet flight, from Moscow to Khabarovsk, and I pretended to be a local, so it was a documentation it was possible. So my tickets were about $6.
$6. So obviously restrictions came about then later in the 2000s when the radio stations restricted, and we had radio station in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and we weren't even allowed to renew the licenses there.
Yes, that's so. We obviously in our mass media, so we thought we have to be in the main cities, in the capital, you know, like Moscow and St. Petersburg and so on. Those were the main. And so we had them already in the 90s, but in actually in Moscow, but in St. Petersburg it was in the 2003, I think. That's when we obtained an AM station there, and so on. So now we ended up in the 2000s, you know, like having the two major studios, like where we did live broadcast from, and as FEBC's ministry in that part of the world, we were one of the first pioneered talk radio. So because we were thinking more about the non-church audience rather than the followers of Christ already. So we were interested in reaching those non-reached and then connect them with churches and so on.
And then restrictions came against those.
Yes, and then restrictions came more and more.
Yes.
But because with Putin, you know, Putinism, you know, in that sense, so the restrictions were kind of, we still had lots of freedom, but it was more difficult. Yes. And we had AM stations, and we used AM stations in some places, FM as well, but then the license were not, you know, they came to an end, and then we prolonged it once and the second time, and then we had the strategic planning. And actually, because of the internet, you know, and the social media started to come in more and more. So our strategic planning was within several years to get out of AM because it's too expensive, basically too much power and so on. So we wanted to go more into the social media, use the internet and so on.
And then the listenership actually again exploded through
social
media.
And then we thought in 3 years, but then after a year, we were not the AM license was not prolonged for Moscow and St. Petersburg, and so we actually went ahead. The government actually, who were kind of putting some pressure on us, so they helped us to advance with our strategic planning. And so we went into social media, and the audience actually grew very much.
Now it's over like 3 million, 4 million.
Yeah, there are millions now. And how it's easier to measure also. Like with radio, it's hard to measure. You know, you approximately, you have responses, you study, you do social studies. But with social media, you see how many listen. You know, you can see it.
And of course, we could talk to Rudi all day because there are so many stories, so vast. So just now, quickly, just then the development of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, just a little bit about the work there. I'd love to touch on, and then of course what everybody is aware of now, particularly here and across the world, the conflict, the war in Ukraine. So maybe if we can touch on some of those areas, because I know our Central Asian teams all work together, all Russian speaking, and all have great fellowship together, but of course find themselves in different times these days.
Yeah, in 91, you know, when Soviet Union fell apart, there were 15 countries overnight, you know, fresh new countries. And so in the 90s, especially in missiology, you know, we were talking, and it was a big trend to ethnic groups, you know, like many ethnic groups, the languages. We had even the World by 2000. I don't know if you remember that project and so on. And we talked about groups that had at least 1 million listeners, 1 million people, and so on. So of course, even in the 90s, we started the ministry in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, in Chernovtsi. Our first studio was there because we met people there, and the Ukrainian. There were many more evangelical churches as well, you know, throughout the country. So Ukrainian started quite early, and also in Ukrainian language we started. But then, you know, we used to broadcast even via shortwave, like some Kazakh, Kyrgyz programs, you know, so some Christians, a few Christians who were there and ended up in the West, so they did the recording, and so we put them in the schedule. But to make the story short, so now there are some languages that are living and developing, especially those new countries, like the Kazakh language. It was a kitchen type of language, you know, in the Soviet time, because everybody had to study Russian and speak Russian, but now it's an independent country, you know, so the language is being developed, you know, the Kyrgyz. So at this time, like, to make the story short, you know, so we have these so-called 4 fields, you know, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. But of course, there's work in Moldova and Belarus and,
Yes.
and Uzbekistan and
Yes,
so on.
yes.
But that's where we have centers and
Yes.
studios and the recording and our first goal, like in Central Asia, all those stans, those Muslim people groups, like Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, Tajik, Turkmen, so those stans. And so we thought that Almaty in Kazakhstan would become the center. It's the largest country in Central Asia, and so the most open-minded politically, in that sense it was at that time in the 90s and then the 2000s. And so we started in Almaty, but now of course it's a long story, but a very kind of interesting, like Macedonian call, I called it sometimes, like to Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. It's a smaller country, but it ended up to be more open. There was kind of a few revolutions, so the wildness of it, but that whenever there are difficulties and challenges, that means opportunities as well. So and we took advantage of some opportunities, and now we have a network of 6 FM stations in Kyrgyzstan, and of course we use social media as well, but the network of FM stations puts us on the map as well.
So Rudi, can you tell us, just to bring it into the day and what we're facing with the conflict, with the war in Ukraine, how is that impacting all this area and fields work, particularly our radio work?
Yeah, of course, the Russian language is a common language throughout Eurasia, through that part of the world, the former Soviet Union and so on. And so we actually in FEBC's ministry, we see that as a region, we call it Eurasian, region and so on. So the former Soviet republics, maybe even now some Poland and those Eastern European countries. And so the war, of course, at least the Ukrainian and Russians, they are the closest kind of brother nations. They were all together. So it was
Yes.
under the communist, the terrible communist era. They went together and so on. Then now they fell apart. Now they were independent countries,
Yes.
and big countries. Ukraine is a huge country. It's 48 million, people. So it's not a tiny country like Estonia has less than about 1 million people. So Ukraine is much larger. So. But then, of course, Moscow has a hard time with it, kind of, break off, and so on. So even in the old days, persecution, I'm jumping here a little bit, but the biggest persecution in the Stalin's times, was, and before that, especially before that, was people who left the Orthodox Church, even in that times.
Right.
They were persecuted even more than evangelical Christians who came from the West or so,
So would that tie in with the change from when Ukrainian creators are Ukrainian Orthodox?
Exactly. So for that reason, it upsets the kind of the Putin's people, much more the kind of objection from Kiev rather than from Almaty also,
Right.
So they're different. So they didn't make it such a huge issue. But here, our brothers, kind of putting their head up,
So how is the work through FEBC? It's obviously not known as FEBC in Russia or Ukraine or these other countries, because we try to understand and use local names that people identify with and not necessarily connect to the West. But how is radio, social media, online streaming, those type of radio ministries or media ministries, how important are they now?
Oh, they're very important, and we have been especially from the 90s, from when we went inside. So most of us, even myself, like growing up, living 21 years in the country, and so on, and broadcasting, speaking fluent Russian, or Victor, some of these people, we stopped doing the broadcast on a regular basis. We were more guests on the studio, and up to this day. So I am participating as a guest, But before I did daily broadcast. Now it's all Eugene, it's Alexei, it's all
that. How is that impacting the people? Like I hear what sort of stories are coming back or feedback from the people that listen?
It's their own people, and of course, like they appreciate it, so the stories, of course, I have lots of stories from the time when I did daily broadcast myself, you know, and so people wrote to me, you know, and so I often.
What are those type? Because there's
Well,
similar story. What are the things that stick in your mind?
I give you one story of Alex, you know, from the Far East, from Vladivostok. So he wrote to me, you know, so long letter. So on Saipan, you know, I was Saipan, long letter. So it was the first letter, but it was a very long one, you know. So, and he was saying, you know, I went through the shortwave and then heard you, you know. So you sounded like a young fellow, you know, so like a decent guy, you know, not born yesterday, you know, as we say it, and so talk about God, about this nonsense, you know. So I had some fun, you know. So was amused, you know. And then listened to something else, and then he said 2 years later, when my wife left me, when I lost my job, you know, so I remembered you and I was looking for you. And then I listened for a while, you know, and that now I'm like you, I believe in God and follow Jesus, you know, in that sense. So I was thinking that for me that's a typical story. It's not an individual.
And so that's what we're hearing today, right? During the war, because the counselors are reaching out to people and may have heard about Jesus in the past, but all of a sudden now
He's real. God is real.
He's real.
Salvation is real. You know, you need. You know, you might die tomorrow. What will you do?
Yes.
You know,
yes.
and then they remember that. That's what I'm saying. I often ask theologically, you know, why did Jesus tell parables? You know, stories, and then, you know, he himself answered the disciples, said, well, because if I would tell them straight, they would not get it.
Yes,
you know,
yes.
But even the parable they would not get. You know, the
yes,
disciples had a hard time. But that's like a seed, you know. In the right time, when the soil is ripe, you know, ready, then it bears fruit. And that's what I always in our seminars, you know, with young broadcasters, I say, don't worry if people make fun of you. Just remain smart, you know, and talk smart, you know, and well, you know, in that sense, and excited.
Yes.
So they will remember. Yes. They will remember at the right time.
Yes.
It will be a fruit.
So thanks, Rudi. Thanks for sharing some of your story today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a privilege to be here in Australia.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay.